Today is Wednesday, November 6th, and this is Spring Office Hours, Season 3, Episode 37, Spring for GraphQL, with a couple of really special guests. My name is Dan Vega, Spring Developer Advocate at Broadcom, and I am not joined by my good friend and colleague, Deshaun. Deshaun is off in Barcelona at VMware Explore, so we're wishing him all the luck. I know he's had a full week out there, so Deshaun, if you happen to be listening, I hope things are going well for you there. Before I bring on my guests, I just want to kind of go over a couple of things. Again, this is a live stream. If you are here in the live stream, we have two special guests that can answer some questions. So please get your questions in. If you are not here in the live stream, you can catch the replay on the Spring Developer YouTube channel. You can also go ahead and catch this wherever you get your podcast. We turn this into a podcast that should be up the following day. So with that, I'm going to go ahead and bring on my special guests. And here they are, Brian and Rossen. Gentlemen, how are you doing?
Hello. Good.
Good.
We are here to talk about Spring for GraphQL. So before we do, though, I want to just get a quick introduction for those of you, for those in the audience who may not know you, and just kind of how what you work on and kind of what you do with Spring for GraphQL, because that's what we're talking about today. So I'll kick it off to you, Brian, first.
Sure. So I'm Brian. I'm located in France, and I've been working in the Spring team for more than 10 years at this point. Mostly on web-related features. So in Spring Framework, Spring.
I think I lost you for a second there, Brian.
Oh, you lost me.
Yep,
okay.
You're back.
So working with Rossen on a lot of web-related parts of Spring, including Framework. I'm also in the Spring Boot team, and I'm working with Rossen on Spring for GraphQL.
Awesome. Rossen?
Yeah, hello from me as well, Rossen Stoyanchev. I work on the Spring Framework team for some time, focusing on web development. When the Spring GraphQL project started, I was naturally involved from that angle. And to this day, Brian and I are very much involved in the Spring GraphQL project. So that's among the things that I do. I've been involved with also the Reactor team, RSocket a little bit, a few areas like that are related to web development.
Cool. Okay, so I have a bunch of questions. I know we fielded some questions from Twitter and from LinkedIn, so we'll get to those. But again, if you're here on the live stream, please get your question in, and we'll see if we can't answer them. I figure we kind of start just a little from the beginning at a high level. Just in case people are not aware of Spring for GraphQL. I guess, how did Spring for GraphQL kind of start? I know there was some community projects out there. I know there's a really popular implementation of the spec with GraphQL Java. Do either of you want to just kind of take it, like, how did this project get started?
Sure. Yeah. So we were a bit of a late starter, I guess you might say. The field was, you could say, quite busy with a lot of solutions. Probably going back to 2016 or so, with a couple of guys at Atlassian who started GraphQL Java. So they worked on that, and they advanced it. Using it at scale at their company. And they've been sort of leading that, but around it, there's also a rich ecosystem that evolved around GraphQL and Java with lots of different frameworks and different solutions. And I think for some time, our take was that there are good solutions out there, and it wasn't as much on our radar. And in the meantime, the GraphQL Java guys try to also provide a little bit of a layer on top of GraphQL Java. And because Spring is the most widely used programming model, they basically focused on doing that. But they went through a couple of iterations and eventually ran out against the fact that they would rather focus on GraphQL Java and leave the Spring to people like us. And So basically, at some point we got introduced. I think it was Sebastian Deleuze actually,
Oh, nice.
who was in touch on a Kotlin forum or question. I forget the exact details. So it started from there. With some interest, and we said, okay, let's consider doing a first class integration. And that's how we got started, by collaborating with the GraphQL Java team, replacing what they actually had at the time, as well as other Spring-related solutions also that got deprecated in favor of what we created eventually.
Awesome. I often get questions. A lot of the talks I do on GraphQL are kind of designed to like introduce people to GraphQL. And obviously the big question right off the bat is like, hey, we're already using REST. We have REST APIs in our organization. Why should we move over to GraphQL? Are there some things that kind of stick out to either of you that like, hey, these are, because again, I think the big thing is like not just using something to use it, right? Like you have to understand the use cases and why it's not a perfect fit for everything. Same with REST, right? Are there some use cases where you go, this is where GraphQL is like a really good fit?
Yeah, I think there are a couple of good ones. I'd say if you can you hear me?
Yep.
Okay. If you're happy with REST right now, I don't think there's a compelling reason to switch. Like it's not a trend thing, or REST is not going to go away because GraphQL exists.
Yep.
We are perfectly happy in Spring maintaining like our REST stack and GraphQL, and like there's some kind of synergy as well. So it's not a or choice. Then I'd say if there are many cases, and most of them involve some requirement of flexibility in the response you're sending to your clients. So it can be about several things. So one typical example is a bit like Netflix. Actually, you have a bunch of different clients. Some are mobile, tablets, like desktop and whatnot, and they have very different needs or very different UIs. And then you either have to go with almost one REST API per client or one media type view per client for go with GraphQL, where you're providing a schema, and each client can decide what data to ask for, and that's a first very compelling usage, where if you have like a wide variety of clients and you need flexibility there, GraphQL will definitely help. There are many other things that we can talk about as well, like if you want a schema-based API, which really helps. So there are solutions in the REST world with OpenAPI and others. This is one of them, but this one is really powerful in the sense that it's got like a language server, DSLs, and many tools, because the schema and the spec are very well defined. So you can have client generation, you can have linters, you can have a wide variety of middlewares that you could use. So that's also a big an important step if you're choosing GraphQL.
I think for me, sort of a key moment I'll take it from a more personal experience, sort of how it got my attention. I think when we were working on the migration from Jira to GitHub issue tracker, we created a script or a program to basically create the issues based on what's in our previous issue tracker. And at the time, I worked with the GitHub API, and I noticed that there was a deprecation notice on their REST API. Version 3, and it pointed to the GraphQL API that they have as sort of the next thing. And I thought that was quite unusual, and I was even a bit surprised to see that. And that's sort of how it piqued my curiosity. Of course, subsequently realizing that they're not actually, fully replacing it, but rather providing an alternative, and really meaning to spend more effort and evolve the GraphQL side of things. So I think and you can of course read about their, background. There's a blog post that talks about it. But I think what can be attractive in many cases is sort of this idea that you can, if you have an API where you have to present a bunch of data, that data represents the information that you want to serve, and it's a sort of a text-oriented API, we might say, as opposed to the sort of rich HTTP capabilities with many media types, where you can do all sorts of things. And we have to be clear that GraphQL and REST are in many ways not a one-to-one comparison. I see GraphQL as more of a higher level, more specialized protocol that works on top of HTTP, but can also work on top of WebSocket. It can work on top of RSocket and just about any other transport level protocol. It really focuses on one thing, which is to serve data. And if you have a text-oriented API where you need to serve that data, it becomes very attractive to be able to define your schema, to discuss that with the rest. It kind of brings together a number of different people from different areas in order to evolve and talk about what is it that you present to the outside world. And that schema becomes a central point of collaboration. So there's the technical side of things, that it simplifies doing all that and makes it easy for clients to consume, which is why it's become popular. But there's also the sort of the pragmatic side of this kind of specializing on something that it does quite well. If you have a very rich text or a data API, like if you imagine the GitHub really APIs, there are many events, many issues. It becomes quite hierarchical. Managing all that with links and individual URIs, I guess it becomes a challenge. And I think when you find yourself in that area, it begins to become attractive to, hey, what if we focused on the data that we expose? And there was a sort of a first-class way of getting the data that you want.
I think, for me, to kind of both of your points there, I was in an organization where, we had many microservices, and like all these different teams are consuming these microservices, right? And it's like you start out with this well-intention of this well-defined REST API. And then this team, hey, I need the data in this format, and I want an endpoint for this. And then another team comes to you and says the same thing. And it's like, over time, this REST API kind of balloons, and you have this, like I say, explosion of API endpoints, right? And we know the more code that we have to write, the more code that we have to maintain. And so it just becomes a real pain in the butt.
With REST and HTTP, the more the URLs, that's a value, right? You're exposing more value. It's just that the way that it's broken down, and it's on a very fine-grained level, can be a bit challenging to consume and a bit challenging to produce and to maintain and manage. And I guess if at the end of the day you're serving data, then again, having a schema for it becomes a very attractive way. We have the spring survey, the annual spring survey, and a specific trend that we've seen over multiple years now is sort of this shift towards ways of exposing APIs that are structured around something, whether that's a GraphQL schema, whether that's HTTP API definitions. It's just applications are gravitating towards having some sort of a contract, and that works well in many cases.
And I speaking of the schema, I think another one of the like highlights for me when I talk about GraphQL is because we have this schema in place, we get some really nice features developed, like DX features, right? One of which is, again, going back to the organization I was in, anytime I had to talk to a REST API and there wasn't documentation, now I got to get on Slack or get on a phone call with someone and find out, like, what does that REST API actually do? because we have a schema, we get this auto-generated documentation. And if I know where the GraphQL server is, I can just kind of pull that up, inspect that, and start playing around with it right away. And then because of that schema, you also get a lot of that IntelliSense when you're trying to like pick out things from the schema that you want to pull. So I think there's some really great features there because of the schema.
And it's a rather simple way to define exactly what you are trying to expose, and then to add notes and documentation or even annotations the same way you annotate Java code, and then to consume it from the client side with the UI in the browser.
Yep. So we kind of touched on this before the show started, but one of the things, you know, I keep seeing, and again, we hear like, I hear it in many different forms, but I see articles and videos of people saying like, GraphQL is dead, nobody should use it anymore. And as to your point, I think people get caught up in comparing it as a one-to-one, like you said. It shouldn't be an either or. It's just another tool for a job. If you have the right tool, then it can make that job easier. But I hear like people aren't using GraphQL, and we know that's not the case. I mean, our friends at Netflix are using it at probably bigger scale than anyone. You just mentioned GitHub is using it, so there are definitely use cases for it. But why do you think we keep hearing people say it's dead? Do people compare it too much to REST? Like, I'm used to using REST. There's no status codes in a GraphQL like response. I can't do that. What do you hear from developers?
I think there's a lot about cycles. You know, we've been through quite a few. If you've been long enough in the industry, you've been through quite a few iterations already. So like a very flexible or like very schema oriented up until like RPC infrastructure. I don't know, service buses, however you call it. There are some variations of things, and those going out of trend or being I mean, interestingly, from the Spring ecosystem perspective, we're seeing a lot of growth there. So maybe it's going out of fashion in some other places, but definitely not in our Java world.
Awesome.
So I'm really glad about this. I'd say that it's really shining in several areas, and in some cases, like we described earlier, it's not going away. Like we've been in touch, and even internally, with teams that are, for example, building very rich UIs with like desktop clients or websites and so on. And for them, the fastest way to iterate is to use a GraphQL API, because they want to iterate the UI very fast and adapt to the new changes, and don't want to just keep busy writing glue code with several REST APIs. And that's one way, and that's a very powerful way for them to be super fast delivering new features to their clients.
Yeah, and in that scenario, if you did have like multiple clients, say you had a mobile app and a front end team and then a back end team, in a traditional sense of development, like a feature would be slated for work, right? And your front end team on the web app or the mobile app has to wait for the back end team to kind of construct those endpoints for you to be able to build out your solutions. With the GraphQL schema in place, like, they can just get going. They don't have to wait for that kind of back-end development for that. So I think that's a really, really interesting pro, if you will, for GraphQL.
There's definitely more flexibility, and
flexibility,
I will also point out that the ecosystem is wider than just Spring GraphQL. So we are seeing growth in our own usage numbers, and we're not the only ones. So certainly, if you look at the GraphQL ecosystem at wide, not only Java, right? There's a GraphQL Foundation. There are a lot of big name companies involved in the evolution of the specification. Yeah, so if you look there, you will see that it is a very strong and vibrant community, and yeah, I don't think it's going away.
Awesome. All right, we do have a question here from Varun. It says, how can security be taken care of in the case of GraphQL, like the way we do in REST, where we have a custom authorization for every endpoint? Can a single GraphQL query have different authorizations?
Yes. So that's very much a natural question when you get exposed to GraphQL, is to begin to get a sense for the capabilities that really matter. How do they apply? So a GraphQL application is very similar to a REST application. In fact, they're both running on HTTP, except with GraphQL, the handling is sort of slightly one layer above, if you will. So we will do and the GraphQL Java engine will do the initial processing of this HTTP request. It will parse the body. It will understand the query and then decide, who needs to get involved in order to prepare the data. And as we do that, in Spring GraphQL, we have a similar programming model to REST controllers. We have, again, controller methods where you can have query mapping methods that will serve the data. And you can do the same things with these query mapping methods that you can do in a REST controller. You can put security constraints on them, authorization rules, and the actual authentication that works the same way as for any HTTP application. You have the same Spring Security filter chain. In fact, Spring Security is very much unaware of the fact that it's a GraphQL endpoint. It's just any HTTP endpoint, and we in Spring GraphQL we make sure that this authentication is propagated correctly to the controller, and that's really where we have to do a bit of heavy lifting, because when you think about a graph of data, it's actually quite very much possible to do a scatter gather type handling, where I'm going to get this data and then I'm going to get this data in parallel because they're on the same level, and then the results are getting put together. And that's really very much the way GraphQL actually works. And I think the whole GraphQL engine, what it enables as an algorithm in GraphQL is very much a sort of a scatter gather algorithm. And in doing that, it's very natural to use concurrency. And when you use concurrency, there's obviously context propagation that needs to, we need to do a bit of heavy lifting there, but we do, and we support it, so that applications can then just do the usual thing on controller methods.
Cool. Okay, I got another question here, and this feels a little loaded because there's two parts to this, I think. But when should I choose GraphQL over REST for certain parts of my API? And so I think the first part of that is, are you really ever like running REST and GraphQL in parallel to each other in a single API?
I mean, I think GitHub is a good example of that, right? They offer
Yeah.
two alternatives. They may be other scenarios where maybe some of it is offered as GraphQL, but I don't think you should necessarily try to choose GraphQL specifically. Again, coming back to the topic of fad
Yep.
or fashion. I think if the concept of exposing the data, if you're exposing a lot of data and that's structured data, I think that you can at least consider what it feels like to build an application with GraphQL and experiment with that. And I think a lot of products and companies, we see that in VMware and Broadcom as well. There's a lot of usage of GraphQL. A lot of applications that were previously written, APIs, cloud APIs that need to expose data about the infrastructure, about all kinds of things. There's just very data-rich API. And I think a lot of that was written in REST previously,
Yeah.
and quite a few got converted to GraphQL with the understanding that there's actually quite a bit of appeal to doing that in the way that it's consumed and also the way that it's exposed.
Yeah, and I think kind of coming back to, don't just rip out your REST APIs and choose GraphQL just to use GraphQL, right? You have to like feel some of these pain points of like all these different clients asking for data in a different shape. The other thing for me, I think we didn't mention, was some of the kind of reasons to move to GraphQL are, if your application, like you said, is kind of aggregating data from multiple sources. So I talk to a database to get this data. I talk to another microservice to get this data. All that could be simplified, but also like the idea of multiple fetching to get like a single resource. The example I use,
that's a really good point, and that's one of the strengths.
Yeah.
So with GraphQL, we're not talking exposing data from a single data source or database or whatever it may be. Again, coming back to the scatter gather, it's a natural way to break down this pattern and make it a sort of structured approach where the GraphQL engine will look at the schema and what you're trying to serve, and it will sort of methodically go through and invoke all the methods that are responsible for invoking that. And you can have this method going to, that data source, and this method going to that data source, and you can assemble in the end data which comes from different sources in a way that makes it relatively straightforward to achieve sort of the concurrency that you need, and also the efficiency in terms of batch loading, because once you start having a graph of data, you're going to quickly run into the n+1 problem.
Yep. Yeah, and I think another thing that comes up
You can
for
do
me
it by
is
hand, right? You can do all these
Yeah.
by hand, but doing it in a way where there's already a large there's a layer underneath that makes it first class citizen. I think that's really the attraction.
Yep. Yeah, and I think another thing that comes up for me is we live in this world, at least I do, where we have access to really fast broadband all of the time, and we forget that the rest of the world is not like this, right? And sometimes our customers are all around the world, and we have to think about like, well, I'm just going to send back these 100 fields because everybody's on broadband and it's not going to take a lot of time. But payload size is a big thing. Like, don't send back 100 fields to a client that's going to use 4 or 5 of them. Have that client just request 4 or 5 of them, and that between that and not having to fetch multiple resources from multiple endpoints at one point, that's really going to help your performance in some of those situations.
And it's not just slow versus fast internet or even access. I mean,
True.
We are on all kinds of devices. Things not working as well as they should in so many scenarios.
Yep. Cool. Okay, I got another question here. I am thinking of trying GraphQL for one of my projects as it solves some of the problems dealing with the front end stuff. Do you think GraphQL will evolve and libraries will be maintained, let's say, for the next 10 years? Is GraphQL here to stay? I guess is the question.
I'm not sure we can really vouch and read into the future that far, but
yeah,
I mean, there's enough investment from a lot of teams and companies that are really using GraphQL, especially for building complex front-end apps. And there's a lot of tooling, there's a lot of support. And even in our case, we're seeing like that's interesting also, because in our issue tracker and at conferences in various places on Stack Overflow and so on, I'm kind of seeing a different mix of developers. So I'm seeing the usual Spring, MVC, REST developers, but I think we're also seeing the ratio of Kotlin developers is more important. Interestingly, because they're used to developing their mobile apps with Kotlin, and it's really interesting for them to develop as well the server app with the same language and the same contract. So if anything, things are growing, and I think the investment from various companies is important enough that I don't think it's going away anytime soon. The spec
Yep.
is well maintained. There are a lot of discussions around improvements. There was the GraphQL Foundation conference not so long ago with a
Yep.
lot of buzz around like federation and other things. So it's healthy to see that the community is coming together on various topics that were initially started by one company or one library, and they're coming together to make it really part of the spec and to align the behavior with the entire ecosystem. So if anything, it's going in a healthy place.
Nice.
And so I don't think it's going away that soon.
Cool. Yeah, two things that kind of stuck out to me there, and which will lead us into our next question. Can we talk about federation? So the question is, how federated GraphQL in big organizations, one GraphQL server for multiple servers for GraphQL for each team? You were saying big companies. I know our friends at Netflix use GraphQL at scale, and they kind of take this approach with federation. But for those who don't know, what is federation? And I know we have some support for it now in Spring for GraphQL.
Yeah, so federation is basically one approach to a microservice architecture with GraphQL, where instead of having a single server responsible for the entire schema, there may be many teams that are more suitably responsible for certain portions of the schema. I think Netflix is definitely a big example of that. They have their data broken out and maintained and managed in different ways. Data that is, in the end related to the customer, but it's sort of different in the back end, coming from different places. So if you want to do something like that, then basically it's a matter of splitting up the schema into different parts and then being able to put it back together. So federation is one approach to doing that, and basically a federation architecture consists of a gateway server through which all requests will come, and the gateway server is aware of multiple backend services that each maintain a subset of the schema that is presented to the client. Now, with federation, there's a little bit of a sort of a non-standard syntax, which is specific to Apollo GraphQL, which is a product that started federation. And that syntax helps to sort of connect the pieces of the schema, the sub portion. So if you have a product and reviews, then maybe the product is maintained at the top level, and then reviews come from a different place, and there's a sort of a relationship with the product ID on a review that's used to make that connection. And so this extra syntax is what helps to do that. And then the gateway communicates to each of those backend services in order to assemble the final response to the client. Now, for this, you need a federation gateway. You need that piece which sits in the front. Then the rest is basically developing your individual GraphQL services, and that's where we come in, and there's a library called Federation JVM, which sits on one of these backend services, and it helps to communicate with the gateway in order to receive requests for, let's say, bring me the reviews for these products, and then the sub-service will then go off and return the reviews and follow the syntax which is expected. So this again goes off of the GraphQL spec a little bit, but not too much. So what we help there is we help with you can write now, as of Spring for GraphQL 1.3, which came out in May. You can write controller methods for these kinds of backend services that will serve a portion of the schema. They're called entity mapping methods, and we basically facilitate that, so it's quite easy to participate in a federated architecture.
Yeah, and I noticed I haven't had a chance to kind of build it out myself yet, but I noticed in the GraphQL example projects repo, there is one example of Federation using that Apollo. If I wanted to do this purely in Spring, could I use like Spring MVC Gateway as the gateway? And then like how would I do it from like Spring side? Is there a way to do that?
So the gateway itself is a completely separate
It's the
product.
Apollo thing, right?
Yeah, it's the Apollo GraphQL. Is basically the product. I know there's an open source version of that, and a lot of people are running that
Gotcha.
basically for their own federation needs.
Okay.
I think Netflix has a Kotlin variant of that, so they basically follow the same spec. There's a spec for federation,
Oh,
and
nice.
they help to drive that spec. So they work with Apollo, the company, and
Cool.
but they have it in Kotlin. But that's not something that's open source or available.
Gotcha. Okay, cool. All right. Thanks for those questions. Keep them coming. Now I know we had some good questions over on Twitter. I asked like last week before we kind of set this up, and I think I want to get to this one first. But it basically says, and this is from Sebastian. It says Spring for GraphQL easily enables batch processing using the @batch mapping annotation and data loader for GraphQL queries. But is there equivalent for GraphQL subscriptions? Streaming in quotes there.
So at the moment, it doesn't seem to be. We, in fact, quite recently came across the fact that the batching is also not something that works out of the box for mutations. Maybe I should take a step back actually and just briefly explain what batching is for those,
Yeah, for sure, because it's
who
a
are not
problem that you may not
familiar with
know until you
GraphQL.
come across it,
Yeah.
right?
So this is the classical N+1 problem. If you've used Hibernate or JPA, you would know exactly what we're talking about. If you have a one-to-many relationship between two types, then basically when you, let's say, type A and product and reviews, if you now get a list of products, well, if you are, if you have some logic that can load a review for a product, that's the N+1 problem, because when you load 100 products, you now have to load 100 reviews, unless you do it in a better way where you say, here are all the products, now fetch me all the reviews and let's join them together. So that's the N+1 issue that you would run into very quickly if you don't take care of that. So GraphQL has a feature that is called data loading, and that allows you to essentially take the keys of the parent and load the associated entities, and that's the batching. That's used very commonly with queries. We recently came across the fact that it doesn't work for mutations, and we reached out to the GraphQL Java guys. We do communicate with them regularly, and turns out that there was no real reason why it doesn't work with mutations. And there is, in fact, an issue now in their issue tracker, and they're making changes to support that for mutations. Lo and behold, just 2 weeks later, this question comes up: what about subscriptions? So we've reached out again to them, and we'll see what the answer is. But the intuitively, and at least for mutations, it worked out that way. Whether it's a query or a mutation is basically it allows you to make a change, but then you can also return data, and that part of it works just the same as a query. So in terms of the batching mechanism for returning the data efficiently, I think between mutation and query, there isn't much difference. I think the same is true for subscription, because subscription, everything that you return, every event that you return, is just a stream of repeating the same query over and over. But we'll see if that actually in practice, if there are any specific challenges to that.
Cool.
So yeah, if it turns out that it's something that can be done, this is a good moment that it's come up. And
Cool.
we are in touch with the GraphQL Java team about it.
Awesome. And I think that's, every time I kind of present on GraphQL, I think that's one of the things I highlight, just kind of the cohesiveness you guys seem to have with the GraphQL Java folks. It seems like it's been a really good collaboration from even like day one, right?
Yeah, definitely. Yeah, it's very mutually beneficial, I would say, um, relationship, and it means that they don't have to. We can consume what they produce, and they can consume what we produce, because
Yep.
Atlassian they use Spring quite a bit as well.
Awesome. Okay, I got another question here, which seems to kind of come back. This is not surprising to me because this is a lot of the questions I get when I talk about GraphQL. It says, for a moderately complex CRUD application, what would be a good recommended approach? Go all in with GraphQL or a mix of REST and GraphQL?
I'd say that for the mixing part, yeah, again, I don't think there are a lot of cases where you really need or want to mix. If the CRUD application works very well with REST, then there's no need to really change things there. If some of the upsides of GraphQL are really interesting to you, then going all in on GraphQL is definitely possible. And I'd say interestingly, maybe the learning curve is not really, on one side it's about the technology itself, because you have to think less about endpoints but more about data. So it applies to many things like the N+1 problem, the security. So instead of thinking I'm going to secure the /employee/salary endpoint, you're going to secure the fetching of the salary data for that employee for all cases. Whereas, and also the other part is about the schema design. So when you're writing the schema, this is an important part because this will be looked at and being used by developers, and there are tools to generate a lot of code and so on. But this part is really important because you want to evolve it as carefully or even more carefully that you would do with REST API. So that's the change, that's where the shift is. But otherwise, I think a CRUD application works perfectly well with an all-in GraphQL application.
And I would also add to really come from a point of view of thinking about the problems. What problems do you have at the moment? Consider those, and then think, would any of that be alleviated by switching to GraphQL? I think that might be a good way to sort of approach it and think about it. But switching just for the sake of switching, I don't think that's really a good way to look at it.
Yeah, avoid resume-driven development. Don't do it just to put it on your resume. You mentioned
not
something.
on important applications.
Exactly. Yeah. You mentioned something, Brian, there, which was like the learning curve, and one of the things developers say to me often is like, there is a little bit of a learning curve with GraphQL, and I'm like, well, sure, there's a learning curve with anything, but I think we've all been building REST APIs for 20 years, right? So all of those things kind of come natural if you've been doing that for a while. But if you look at like REST, like it's not easy to learn right out of the box. Like you have to deal with like all these different request methods and status codes, and how do you do versioning? Like there's a whole bunch of things that come with REST that we just kind of take for granted now because we've been doing it for a while. I don't know. I don't feel the learning curve is much different than if you were to just take a new developer and make them learn GraphQL or make them learn REST. There's a lot to learn in both of those, right?
Yeah, I would even say that for a junior developer, maybe some of the best practices are built in with GraphQL with the schema because there are guardrails for those. Yeah. Whereas with REST, you can, without some guidance or following some patterns, it can be easy to create a REST API that is not REST at all, and that goes against everything that you see on the internet.
Yeah.
So at least on the GraphQL side, if there are some guidance built in, but there are other problems that you need to solve with some well-known patterns or some advice that you would get from other developers about how do you handle like rate limiting, things like that. There are things that you need to apply some recipes there, just like in REST with REST.
And I'll just ask this, kind of knowing the answer. I'm just kind of setting this up for you anyway. But one of the questions I get a lot is like, I want to get status codes back from a GraphQL and a GraphQL query. Like when something goes wrong, I want you to tell me something is wrong. And so for those of you who don't know, like when you get something back, if you were to like look for, say, a product ID of 1234, you're not getting a 404, you're getting a 200, and then there's kind of an error specification at the GraphQL level that defines how errors are returned.
I think the way to sorry,
No, that was really my question around handling errors, right?
Yeah, I think that's a natural thing, and actually the GraphQL over HTTP spec has evolved a little bit in that regard to be a little bit more what's the word, respectful, or to be making better use of the HTTP status codes. But the thing to consider, there's a couple of things. First of all, GraphQL is a high-level protocol. So it can run on HTTP, but it can run on WebSocket, and it can run on other protocols, which means that if you think about this being done over WebSocket, you have multiplexed requests, or fancy way of saying that there are many requests going over the same connection. So now you need some way of deciding, not based on an individual response. You need some way of deciding what happened with that particular request that went out. Just like in WebSocket, when you start creating a WebSocket application, you're no longer thinking so much about status codes.
Great point.
The second thing to point out is that in REST, you have individual requests that are supposed to be fine-grained, and they return data for one individual thing. And you can return a status code for that, and that will tell you, is it missing? Is it forbidden? Is it bad input? But with GraphQL, you can create a query, and that retrieves a bunch of data. That data corresponds to potentially multiple, let's say, REST. In REST, you might have to make a whole number of calls in order to get back that data.
Yep.
So it's really about shifting a little bit the way we think. We're giving a little more power in the hands of the users, which can also be a little bit, troublesome sometimes, because if they try to use too much data, then you need to worry about that as well.
Yep.
But basically, it means that what you're getting back is not so fine-grained or granular. And there isn't one way to say this went wrong. Maybe some of it was wrong. Maybe some of it went wrong. Maybe some of it went fine. And what you get back in a GraphQL response is actually a data section and an error section. And within those, you can get the data. And then at a particular point of the data, you will have a path. And that path may correspond to an error. So you can really get a sort of a more nuanced response than a single status code. That said, our exception handling, and this is a fairly common pattern, that you can actually turn errors into sort of status codes, or the equivalent of status codes, the same names of those status codes, and you can return those in your GraphQL error section.
So you can look for those.
Still achieve that effect, but again, we need to think a little bit more broadly that a response may be partly successful, or maybe I should say partly some data missing in the response.
Right. Yeah, and that's important because we have that graph of data. So we could get a product with 1, 2, 3, 4, and then be looking for specific reviews, and maybe the reviews came up null. And we need to know that so that we don't go try to display them, right?
So maybe it's still useful to get all the products, you just didn't get the reviews.
Right.
Yeah.
Right.
I guess it's, if you come into the GraphQL field with your REST glasses on,
exactly,
it's easy to think, oh, this is the worst REST API with a very bad design, because it's single endpoint, it's always HTTP 200, and when there's an error, I have to look into the response. This is very bad. But it's like when you try to embrace what it is designed for, you see why that is.
Yep. Cool. I have another question from Twitter here, and this goes back to our friends at Netflix. Netflix has a product called DGS, Quickly, if we could talk about what DGS is, but how to choose between DGS and Spring for GraphQL. Is there a way to choose between them?
Yeah, that's a good one actually. So our friends at Netflix, they were on the path a little bit before us. In fact, when we were just getting started with the GraphQL Java team, a little bit into that, they came out with the announcement that they were open sourcing what they were doing internally. Netflix uses Spring in a very big way, and they basically create their own integration of what we didn't have essentially at the time. And it took us quite some time to sort of begin to build out similar feature sets. Initially, we had a much more limited scope. The goal, especially the way the GraphQL Java team saw it originally, was more modest. Just to provide a thin layer over GraphQL Java that's still fairly unopinionated. But as we got into it, we eventually realized that actually to provide real value, you need to provide a programming model. That means controller methods, and so eventually, little by little, we ended up building out a programming model that's quite comparable to DJS framework. Now, we've been in touch with the DGS team from the very beginning. In the beginning, it was sort of difficult to imagine what we can do because we just didn't have the features. Then we went through a few versions, and eventually we got to a point where we filled out on the features. So it's pretty comparable now. And over the past year, we've been working with the DGS team, and we have now got to a point where we have a common foundation between the two. We thought again how to integrate and how to best help the community with the choices that they would need to make. So basically, the DGS team is not really interested in maintaining the transport level. What you run over, so the bits that have to do with integrating with Spring MVC, with Webflux, with Spring Security. This is now with WebSocket, with RSocket. This is now something that they've made possible to run DGS on top of Spring for GraphQL. So we are basically the same foundation. But on top of that, you have the DGS programming model, and you have the Spring for GraphQL programming model that are alternatives that you can use. We are really excited about this because it means that Netflix runs at scale on the same foundation as Spring for GraphQL.
That's
and
great.
We're getting
Yeah.
a good test, and we got plenty of sort of back and forth, when we were building it out to make sure the performance is good. And we got to a point where it's actually even a little better than what was there before. So that's really nice to have that confirmation. From their point of view, they don't miss on anything because they can still keep their applications with full backwards compatibility, and they can sort of begin to phase out the whole layer of their stack, the transport layer, for which they don't have a tremendous amount of interest. There's actually a really nice blog post by Paul Backer, who is the DJS lead, that explains all the history and how they view it. So that basically tells you that you can choose either one, and you're running on the same foundation. So there's also another side to it that I would point out. If we want to sort of compare, I would say that with Spring for GraphQL, you basically have a level of sort of consistency and integration into the Spring ecosystem that's about as close as it can be. Brian and I are both on the Spring Framework team. We actually originally considered this as possibly as another module, just like there's a Spring Web MVC. We thought, there could be a Spring GraphQL module. Eventually, we went for a separate project because we thought there was enough to it. But it's the same people maintaining it, and the APIs that we ended up with, they're very closely aligned with what we have in Spring MVC. So there's a sort of continuity and consistency that you will see between the way that things are done in Spring MVC and Spring for GraphQL. The same is true on the boot side. So Brian is a core member of the Spring Boot team as well on the website. So he's making sure that our integration there is really as good as can be. And I have to say that this is not as simple as it sounds. I mean, I'm on the inside, and often I think of suggestions to the boot team, and then it turns out that I'm, not. There are plenty of things that I did not think about of how things work in boot and what's the best way to integrate. So it's really nice to have that as well. So I think those are the things I would point out. The other thing is that, with the APIs, you'll find that we've gone the extra mile on quite a few corners where eventually, we were trying to match the feature set. And I think we ended up going beyond in a number of areas. So, for example, we have exception handling, annotated exception handlers as a feature. You can use controller advice and exception handling the way you do in Spring MVC, which is very handy and convenient. Also, I think for Netflix, the real strength is that they run at scale and they see the result of it. They can actually test it. We don't actually have applications that we run. For us, a big advantage is that we work with a wide range of use cases, and we talk to a lot of different users who present maybe angles that sometimes within a single company are maybe less important. So we ended up with some features that came through community feedback, because this is how we evolve our feature set. One really nice feature is actually came from a Kickstart project, which was one of the Spring projects that existed before Java Kickstart, and that's the schema inspection, which has become a very popular feature.
Great
that
tool.
Basically on startup, it will tell you if there's any mismatch between your controllers and your schema, and it will warn you about things that are not covered that at runtime might turn out that there's nothing that serves this, and it just ends up being null. So things like that, now these become benefits to DGS as well, because as DGS runs on Spring for GraphQL Foundation, actually you can take advantage of these features and the schema inspection for free. So again, it's a very mutually beneficial collaboration.
And I will go ahead and include that blog post in the show notes, as well as I was at Spring One in Vegas, and Paul did a presentation on DGS. And what I found cool is, like, one controller was using DGS, another controller was using Spring for GraphQL. So
you
don't even have to choose between the two. You can put them both together.
The same application up and running.
And I think behind that question of like DGS versus Spring for GraphQL, there's always that anxiety that I'm choosing one and maybe the other is going to be self-deprecating in favor of the other, or maybe that one of those teams, they won't have the bandwidth to do what I want. And I think in the end, we came up with the best resolution there, which is like the DGS team won't be spending a lot of time maintaining the protocol and a lot of the infrastructure that we are maintaining. And on the other hand, you can, like Spring for GraphQL and DGS users, they won't have to choose one solution and be in some kind of walled garden when they can't go to the other side if they wish to. So it's really the best of both worlds, where you don't, like, you can choose, but it's not a choice for eternity. Basically, you're not tying yourself to one solution.
And pragmatically speaking, they've already built a lot of applications, and it is an important concern, to keep those applications running with as little disruption as possible. But the choice exists. Now we have a common foundation, so all this work was incredibly useful, I think, and it sets up for a future where our communities are a lot more sort of joined together. That's one of the concerns, is sort of splitting the mind share with ideas coming in different directions. So we've began to bridge that gap.
Cool.
We even have support on start.spring.io actually for DGS as well.
I was just there. So there are two starters. One, you can basically pull in like the DGS framework support, right? The other one is the code generation stuff. We won't get into that today, but you can learn more about that in the documentation. So cool. Well, we are running up against it here. We are at our time. Before we kind of close out, just maybe just some big picture roadmap stuff. What are you guys working on now? Do you have anything exciting planned for the future? Where's Spring for GraphQL at right now? And then tell us where we can learn more about you, and we'll get out of here.
So at the moment, we don't have another release coming out in November. I think probably the next thing that's worth talking about at this time is the fact that we have Spring Framework 7 coming in a year's time. That will be very much about a baseline upgrade with Jakarta EE. And that's something that we're very much going to do as well. There's going to be a number of things that come along with that, a significant improvement around nullability that's going to propagate to different projects, including Spring GraphQL. In the meantime, in May, we will have a minor release in order to provide an upgrade. We don't have sort of significant features scheduled at the moment. That's going to come in part through feedback, which we always inevitably get.
How can people give some feedback if they have questions, concerns, if they're using Spring for GraphQL and they're running into issues? What's the best way to give feedback?
Yeah, I think certainly, the usual, Stack Overflow questions and discussions is a good starting point in terms of learning things. We are a little bit more flexible with questions on our issue tracker. Just generally with people trying things out, we try to help as much as possible. So certainly the issue tracker is the main place to communicate with us. If you have ideas or if you're stuck on something, talk to us there, and we'll make sense and point you in the right direction.
Awesome. Brian, if you can be found on the internet, if we can find you, where should we find you at?
Oh, that would be Mastodon these days. I think it's on the link is on my GitHub profile, so that would be my GitHub profile then.
All right, so start at GitHub and find you on Mastodon. I just signed up for Blue Sky the other day. I'm starting to like it, so
cool.
Trying some different avenues here. Rossen, how about you?
I'll be in your steps as well. I think certainly GitHub, LinkedIn. I am on Twitter. I think my days are numbered on Twitter. That's clear. It's more inertia than anything. But
I know I get a lot of anxiety going on there these days.
Yeah, I mean,
okay.
It's sorry for the digression, but it's
no.
It's become where it's quite distracting. It's no longer what it used to be, is what I would say.
I'd say one tip for that I got is
tremendous value. It's just I find that it's just a bit out of control in terms of what comes through.
I agree.
For no good reason.
And
I
block
on my
stuff
Android,
on there, but it doesn't
which
work.
is not a newest Android, it crashes probably after 5 minutes of use, not more than
that. Boy. All right. Well, hopefully we'll all find a good, safe space to collaborate in. But hey, I know we've been trying to do this for a while. So Brian, Rossen, I really appreciate you guys coming on and talking GraphQL. And looking forward to the future of the project. I get to go out and talk about GraphQL all the time, so I'll definitely be bugging you guys as some more questions come in.
Thank you, Dan.
All right, thanks guys. Have a good one, everyone.
Bye-bye.